And so I think what Zelensky's trying to do now is to find a way to bring the war home to Russia. If the Russians do not negotiate and this war continues, it's going to be increasingly painful for Russians. When Vladimir Putin and other Russians say NATO is preparing war, it's nonsense. I think if you look over the past 8 to 10 months, what you've seen in terms of the conversations that have taken place, about a peace settlement. I believe the Ukrainians, they're weary of war. I've been to Ukraine both in the last couple of years, and my sense is Ukrainians are weary of war. They would like the war to end, but they are not prepared to accept onerous Russian terms. They're not prepared to surrender to Russian demands. But I think they are prepared if the Russians were reasonable and looking for a compromise. I think the Ukrainians are prepared to make some concessions that would be fairly painful to bring the war to an end. Unfortunately, you have seen no such readiness on the part of the Russian side. Go back in the last few months when people like Foreign Minister Lavrov, when they articulate and they specify the Russian demands, those demands haven't changed since 2024. And the Russians are demanding things like Ukraine not only has to give up the territory that Russia occupies, but the Russians are demanding that Ukraine give up territory that the Russian military has never occupied. And so I think what Zelensky's trying to do now is to find a way to bring the war home to Russia and to make clear that if the Russians do not negotiate and this war continues, it's going to be increasingly painful for Russians. And I think you've seen this in several ways. I mean, first, the large Russian casualties on the front line. The last 6 or 7 months, the Ukrainians reporting that they're inflicting casualties, 30 to 35,000 Russian soldiers killed or severely wounded every single month. That's a huge human cost. But with the increased Ukrainian capabilities now to conduct deep strikes into Russia, they're basically also inflicting economic pain. And it's also, I believe, undermining Vladimir Putin's narrative. Going back to 2022, Putin does not call this a war. He says it's a special military operation. And in fact, in Russia, if you call it a war, you can go to jail for discrediting the Russian military. But part of that narrative going back to 2022 was to tell the Russian people, it's not a war. We're not going to draft your sons and force them to go and fight in Ukraine. And it's not going to have any impact on you here in Russia because it's limited. And I think what Russians are now finding out, if they live next to an oil refinery or an oil terminal, or if they live next to a Russian arms plant, that in fact the war is going to affect them. And I believe that Russians who are now sitting in lines to buy gasoline, where in many parts of Russia it's now being rationed or not available. In Crimea, there is no gas available for private citizens. So you're now beginning to see that the war is coming home to Russia. And I think this is part of Zelensky's effort to try to make clear to the Russians and to Putin that the longer this war goes on, the more painful it's going to be for Russia, both in military terms and in economic terms. And the hope there is to persuade the Kremlin to negotiate in a more serious way. So that was my sense when I was in Kyiv a couple of months ago, is they would like to bring this war to an end. They want to negotiate, but they don't find in the Russians a partner who's ready to negotiate in a serious way. And so they're trying to change that calculation in Moscow. And if the Russians are not prepared to negotiate, I believe the Ukrainians are prepared to fight on. And if you look at the last 4 or 5 months, it's Ukraine, not Russia, that has the initiative on the battlefield. Well, when Vladimir Putin and other Russians say NATO is preparing for war, it's nonsense. Go back and look at the defense spending of NATO countries going back to, say, before 2014. Pretty much every NATO country, the defense spending was on a downward trend. It began climbing in 2014 after Russia used military force to seize Crimea, and then the Russian military became involved in fighting in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And then you saw a real increase after 2022, when Russia's all-out invasion turned the Russia-Ukraine conflict into the largest and bloodiest war that Europe has seen since 1945. So I think what you have in Europe are countries looking and saying, this is a Russia with Vladimir Putin who is prepared to use military force to achieve political goals.